strategy today, and we want to really start thinking about how we move forward. So to make that happen, we're going to go through this learning from the first 5 sessions. That just means I've tried to summarize those so that it reminds us all what did we talk about on those sessions, so that that's all fresh for us as we get to our strategy conversation. Next. So our first conversation was with Dr. Peter Hammer. He talked about race, rates, and infrastructure. We went through structural racism, which is a key component here when we're talking about water infrastructure issues. And so the oppression piece, and also sometimes we see this in the bureaucracy of not only infrastructure, but water systems, other utility systems, et cetera. So we thank Peter for that. Next. So Dr. Shetty and Panazzo talked about the local view of affordability. So this was focused on a review in Toledo and some specific studies there. And that is so interesting because these water bills, high water bills in Junction are on locations where houses have been demolished, right? So those high remaining water bills, people may have had to abandon those houses because of water. And those are the types of things we're definitely trying to avoid, any liens against homes or those big debts that can accrue from overdue water bills. Mm-hmm. We also want to make sure renters are protected, that this isn't something that's just between a landlord and a water company. Next, please. Dr. Hope Bland, again, talking about systemic racism, environmental racism in water. And the statistics that she shared, I think, are shocking, that millions of Americans can't afford their water bills. They've risen 80% in a decade. That's just on average. We know in some of our cities, they've risen much faster than that. And so how can we expect people who are struggling with the expenses to be able to meet those increasing water bills when incomes are not increasing at that rate? Next slide. Dr. Otis talked about ending racism. And I really loved these words that she put on a slide, that we're not born with racism. It's aggressively taught through families, neighborhoods, faith communities, storybooks, TV, all of those things. It's so ingrained, but it's not because that's the way we're born. And so that is a really important piece for us to remember, that this is created and embedded in our culture, in our institutions, but we can change it. Next, please. So then Dr. Haith and her daughter talked about dismantling institutional racism, the health inequities, histories of how access has been afforded or not afforded. Disease outcomes are critically important, and we all know that given COVID at the moment. And talking about the funding and education are so critical to that, to resolving those issues. Next, please. Donald Wiggins was with us talking about community benefit agreements. And that's a really critical piece, because sometimes when we create, change, develop infrastructure or other kinds of development, you can create one of these legal agreements that can benefit the community and bring the community to the table so that everybody can benefit from the development that happens. So that's a great piece that Donald brought. Next, please. Aisha talked about community lawyering. This was really a great session for me because just talking about focusing from the community's perspective instead of from a group perspective, which I always think is so important if we're going to actually solve the problems that need to be solved. Addressing those root causes and creating interdependent relationships so that one side needs the other just as much as vice versa. I think that's really key parts, and we certainly try to live that at Freshwater Future. Next, please. Then we had Dr. Peggy Berry talk about water as a life source. And she talked about a few, unfortunately, it's just a few in the long list of threats to our water, but important ones: climate change, chemical spills, stormwater runoff, fracking, coal ash, ag pollution, chemicals, moving backwards on the Clean Water Rule. All of those sorts of things, and there are more, we have to be paying attention to and making sure that our communities want to stay informed about how these are playing out in individual communities. Next, please. Then we had this great team from We the People of Detroit, Dr. Gaber and Professor Kudel talking about, oops, I made a mistake there. They did not talk about community lawyering. They were talking about local resident-driven research. And they were talking about the health impacts of water shutoffs. What I found this side particularly interesting because even where a health authority calls for a moratorium on water shutoffs for vulnerable groups, we're seeing that that doesn't necessarily play out on the ground. And in this particular case, 82% shouldn't have been vulnerable to those water shutoffs because of their health concerns, and yet we know that people were being shut off. So it's also important for us to make sure there are accountability measures in any of the solutions that we might talk about. Next, please. Okay. So we actually had a few additional presenters, which I was not able to capture in this set of slides, but I know you are all remembering them. So that's kind of where we came from with the presentations. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the surveys. So if you filled out a survey that we sent last week, this is where you'll see that data. Next, please. So this is a bit of a complicated slide, but it's not. In reality, this is just how many people said how much each particular topic resonated with their own work at home. And the legend on the right side is in the same order as these bars in the chart. So if you can't tell the colors apart, you can just go down and look at them. They're in the same order. But really key pieces, you know, the Flint Community Lab spoke to a lot of people: race, and infrastructure. We saw public health and affordability was right at the top. Citizen science and mapping, that's the work from We the People of Detroit. And paths to affordability. So those are kind of the things that people felt resonated with the work they're doing back home. And also important were partnerships and citizen science, and the example we saw from Baltimore, which I think was a great example of affordability plan in play. Next, please. So we also asked, are you interested in forming a water affordability collective based on the 10 points, which we've been talking about throughout, and you'll see more about today. And we got a resounding yes from most folks. So 16 yeses and 5 nos. So that's probably why you're all here, and we're glad you are. Next, please. So we also asked if you're interested, are you interested at the local level, the state level, or the federal level? And so many people are interested in at the local level, which is not a big surprise. That's great. We also have a lot of people interested at the state or provincial level. And then we have a good number, 7 out of the 25 who participated, who are interested in the national level. And then I put these last 2 bars on because some people chose multiple, which was an option. And so some folks want to work on at least 2 levels, or some want to work at all 3, which is great. So that's just some indications about where we all are thinking we'd most like to work on the affordability issue. Next, please. So here are some of the results when we asked, do you have questions about what it might look like to work on a collective strategy for affordability? And so we had several that I just want to quickly go over because they'll be important as we get into our discussions. So I put them into 3 groups. One was utility financial. This is obviously a big concern because we have to be able to pay for it if we're going to continue to have water. So people asked, how do we afford cleaning the water into the future? It gets more expensive the more toxins you start with, obviously, then the cleaning becomes more expensive. How can we improve my community financial return? It's a great question. I like how that's phrased. How to collaborate with utilities, especially when it comes to their financial health. So how do we pay attention to both sides of that equation? How do we make people pay for the real price of their water? I'll just say, I'm not sure we do. I think we have to get creative and maybe lower the prices of the water in some places. And then how to get the federal government to assist with water affordability. I think the federal government used to pay for about 70% of the costs of water infrastructure in the country. And now it's down to about 7%. And so we think that in this time when we have to upgrade because we have 100-year-old or more infrastructure in most places, we're probably going to need the federal government to invest during that time frame while we're upgrading and making improvements. The next category was on the human right to water. Should clean water access be of concern to school boards in areas affected? Absolutely. I think school boards, a lot of them are finding out they have lead that can be from fixtures or internal pipes, could be from out in the street pipes. So that's definitely a concern. And then how to outlaw water shutoffs. That's what we're going to talk about. That's one of the things. So next slide. And then the final category was more process-oriented questions. Can we create sort of a technological holding space for stuff like potential legislation, current legislation, ordinances, et cetera, listservs? So that was a question. I think we can. Where is it most effective to focus efforts, local, state, or national? I think it has to be all 3, but we'll talk more about that. What strategies can be employed for influencing the influencers, which is a great question. And what does the process entail? How can we enlist those affected by shutoffs to join the movement? Actually, I think they're already here. I think there are a lot of people who have been participating who are either working with or have experienced shutoffs in the past. And some of the groups that have been on the call certainly are working directly with folks who have been shut off. And so we'll talk more about that, and Monica may be able to give us some more information. What strategies affect the will of voters to raise their voices? How can we teach children to see the value in water? How to get the federal government to assist with affordability? And can water quality be added to criteria for receiving public housing vouchers? It's an interesting one I hadn't thought about. So wonderful questions. Next slide, please. And then our final set of questions was around strategy. We asked you, what are your thoughts about ideas for how can we move on water affordability? And so these are some of the things that came from that. Sharing information, victories, and resources, getting a permanent ban on shutoffs, working with most impacted communities, locally and regionally coordinated teams, collaboration, big tent, multi-sector. This was saying we need to build a much bigger set of folks to be able to influence this. Increase federal financial resources and technological tools for connecting and sharing. So you can see the questions sort of dovetail with the strategies, but that's great. I think these raise some important points as we go into our discussion. Next, please. So that was the end of the sort of review. And I hope that helped a little bit. I know it was very fast, but now we want to ask you 3 discussion questions. And the way we'd like to do this is if you could utilize that chat box that Alexis was talking about. So if you put your mouse over the bottom of the screen and click on chat, it should bring that right up for you. And what we'd like to do today, since we don't, is to ask you to answer one of these questions at a time. So let's begin with the top one. Just wondering what has resonated most for you from the presentations you heard. So I know not everybody was able to be at every one, but let us know what resonated the most for you from those presentations. Just take a minute now to do that. And those will be public. Everybody will see your answers. People are entering, which is great. And I don't think we have any phone participants today, so that should help us in that hopefully everybody will be able to see these answers. All right, so we're getting some good responses, which I appreciate everyone. Feel free to browse through those. And we will capture these, so don't worry, we will capture them and put them in a document that you can look at later if you're interested. So very good to see all these different things that people got from the discussions. In terms of the surveys that we just showed, those few graphs and results of questions and ideas for a collective. Any thoughts on that? Please share any ahas that you may have had when you saw the results of those questions. For me, it was the fact that so many people are interested in collaboration, which is heartening. So we'll give another 30 seconds and you can fill out that question. And then the same with the last question. Go ahead and enter. Now that we've been through the multiple presentations over the last couple of weeks, what's exciting for you as we look to creating strategy and how we think about water access and affordability? What do you find exciting? All right, well, feel free to continue to enter any responses you haven't finished yet. But I will now ask for the next slide, please, Alexis. All right, and I am actually going to turn this over to my fellow presenter, Monica Lewis-Patrick. Some of you heard her moderate yesterday. And she is a huge partner in this work for Freshwater Future and myself, and we're so happy that she's here to talk with us and help us to think through strategy. So Monica.
Thank you so much, Jill. I appreciate you, and just want to take a minute to say kudos to Freshwater Future and your amazing team. As you stated, 6 of these have already taken place, and now we're at the strategy stage. So thank you, Freshwater Future, and thank you, Jill Ryan, for being an amazing partner. But as we're having conversations over this series of sessions, and as we've been meeting at our local levels with our community and local water partners, Freshwater Futures has really been listening, and we wanted to make sure that we were noting where there seemed to be greater depth in terms of more questions and things that needed to be explored at a deeper level. And so we wanted to make sure we were all walking together at the same place. And so one of the things we wanted to talk about is just how is change being made? You know, how do we create and influence change? And so one of the things we started with was making sure that we were being clear in terms of setting goals, making sure we had objectives, and then we had tactics in order to be able to advance those objectives in order to meet that goal. And so if you'll look at the first slide, one of the things that I would note here as an example is that when you're looking at policies like water affordability, it may vary from community to community, as we've heard over the last few weeks. And so it may be an issue in one part of the state of, for example, Michigan, where you may have the inability to afford the replacement of your lead pipes in the home. And then in Detroit, as was stated, it may be an issue of unaffordable rates. And then when you go maybe to the other side of the state, the west side, it would be issues of PFAS or well replacement needs. And so we really, you know, in those moments, you are able to really help folks begin to connect the dots, not only in what's happening in their local municipalities around the policies and the ordinances that will help advance greater equity and accessibility. But then, as was looked at in the chart earlier, where people were interested in being able to participate not only at their local level, but also their state level, or possibly at their local, state, and national level. And so looking at that, what we wanted to always remind folks is that there are tactics that we've got to identify our target, that power mapping is a great tool of being able to sort of figure out not so much who you like or don't like, but that who holds the power to be able to get you what you're seeking. And so you can't go to a city council person seeking a policy remedy that maybe can only be rendered at the state or federal level. So just making sure we're clear so that we're not wasting energy and we're not exhausting our resources, and we're not taking our community that's most impacted, that really should be leading on these issues, and really using their energy in a way that's not going to be productive. The next slide, please. How change is made. And what we looked at here is we wanted to be able to provide some tools on how to create the pressure points of your target, how to create that change that you're seeking, you know, how to get those meetings with that person that really has the ability to put forth an ordinance or put forth a policy or is influential at the legislative level. And then some of that was really being able to talk through how to make the ask. And one of the processes that we participated in with Freshwater Future and many of our local and regional partners was during the Great Lakes Day event this past year. And it was a wonderful opportunity to allow local voice to sit through a training with great thinkers and visionaries like Alicia Smith, who heads up great work there at Freshwater Future and also is a great leader at Toledo Junction. And then you had other policy leadership able to weigh in and help shape the conversation so that when the community went to meet with the congressional leader, they were not only able to give them a relevant example of what was happening or not happening at the community level, but then they were able to tie bar it to a legislative ask or a need to help that legislator or that aide be able to better inform our congressional leaders at the federal level. Because as Jill stated, we have actually digressed to a point where the federal government used to invest about 69 to 70% into our infrastructure, and now it's dwindled down to about between 7 and 9%. So there is a greater need for the federal government to be involved in making sure that there's greater equity and justice around water and water accessibility. But these things are applicable to any policy issue or any need that we would need to lift at a local, state, or federal level. The next slide, please. How change is made. A tool to pressure your target for change. What we know is that there is the ability to do what we call agitate, legislate, and litigate. And so some of these things are listed here. We know that rallies are sort of the outcry and what you demonstrate to create a visual appearance of frustration and disgruntledness, that there is a problem and that problem needs to be looked at or addressed. But then you also have to educate, because many times we can be upset about something and there not be a full narrative or a complete understanding by the community of why we're upset. And so this is where your education comes in. And I know some examples of that has been, one of those examples has been like right now we're in a moment of rallying and protest around, police brutality and racial oppression. And part of that we know has happened in example to water and water issues. We know that there has been protest in Flint around lead pipe replacement and water toxicity and austerity. We know that there have been protests in Chicago around what is happening with water shutoffs. We know that the same has happened in Detroit and other places. So when you look at that, that was the outcry. But then where does it connect to the policy and the policy that needs to be changed? So this is where the education comes in. So you've had great examples of that. Like when you look at the Flint Development Center and their lab, the lab was the way to use science and research and data to get the attention of others so that they would pay attention that there needed to be a political or legislative remedy to what was happening with the toxic issues in Flint. If you look at in Milwaukee with Milwaukee Water Commons, one of the things they were able to do is use a swim within their river that was connected to a national certified swim meet as a way to bring attention to water quality issues in Milwaukee. And so this has been the creativity and the ingenuity that has played out in communities that really are the communities not only dealing with these issues of oppression and historical harms, but then they're also the same communities that are showing up with a lot of creativity. And even as you've seen over the 6 weeks in Benton Harbor, you've seen artists and creativity speaking in a voice that sometimes speaks to an audience that may not listen to a lecture on water, but they'll listen to a rap song or a poetry slam or spoken word or something that is speaking more to in a vernacular that they can resonate with. So those are some of the examples that we wanted to lift up. We also wanted to lift up that town hall meetings and informational webinars and meetings that include ways for people to engage are critical because as we're hearing and heard over the last 6 weeks, people are trying to figure out where do they fit into this work and how can they offer what they can contribute. And we know that some people give everything and some people can give a little bit of something and then others give nothing. And what we're asking is people to deputize themselves and do what they can do. And so there's a need for photography and artistry. There's a need for mapping and data and research. There's a need for canvassing and phone calling. There's a need for people to deliver water still where people don't have water. And then there's a need for people that are educators to help us create curriculums so that we're educating our babies all along so that they're not repeating these bad cycles and bad behaviors, and they actually are embracing themselves as water protectors and water stewards. And so some of the helpful hints are relationships are everything. And I'm going to say that about 3 more times. Relationships are everything. 2 more times, Jill. Relationships are everything. Relationships
are everything.
So, I mean, I just can't tell you how important it is that whomever you may know or someone else may know that could be an influencer in a situation, and please don't discount who people may have a relationship to. I can give you a great example of a case we were working on in Tennessee where a young man had been incarcerated for and charged with murder of a police officer. And the judge, we needed to influence the judge to provide some leniency because it was an accident. And my grandmother actually knew a group of Black women that were the maids for many of the judges and lawyers in our little small town. And so I invited them to come to court, and those little ladies came to court all dressed up in their Sunday best, and they were able to influence the judge to provide some leniency to these young people. So don't discount it. Do not discount it. You would not have thought that this maid had this much influence on the judge. As a matter of fact, she stood up in the middle of court when he walked in the room and said, "I know, John Beck, you're not getting ready to do this to this boy." So that changed the whole court proceedings. And this can happen too for us in terms of water issues. There was a great example yesterday of the relationship that Reverend Pinckney has in Benton Harbor with Council Member Adams. And so through that relationship, Reverend Pinckney was working on water in terms of getting water to the community and getting filters to the community, but his advocacy was able to influence the councilwoman to then push policies that are changing the conditions in Benton Harbor. So these are the things that we're looking to lift in this moment to make sure that we understand that there are best practices for the work that we're doing, that grassroots is critical to advancing water affordability, not only at your local level, but at your state level and your federal level. And we believe that water is such a critical issue that many of you on this line are influencers, not only at your local, state, and federal levels, but you're also a part of the global collaboration to move and advance the human right to water for all human beings. And so I'll stop there, Jill.
All
And
right,
are we
thank
now
you.
moving into strategy?
Yes. So now, next slide, Alexis. So we're going to talk, and Monica, I think you and I should just tag team this section. I think we want to talk a little bit about this 10-point plan that we've you've been hearing about and hopefully have seen. And I'm going to ask people, ask Freshwater Future staff to put it in the chat box in case anyone still doesn't have it. But essentially, about a dozen or more groups and individuals met in Michigan around water affordability for over 18 months. And this slide is just giving a flavor for some of the things that we did in order to come to the 10 points. We had regular meetings. It took far longer than we thought. We did different things, some phone calls, some in-person meetings. We were in Flint, we were in Detroit. We did whatever it took to get this set of folks and organizations together so that we could come up with a collaborative set of must-haves. And really, that's what this set of 10 things is. They're not all necessarily the piece that has to be legislated, but they are definitely pieces that set the values for what we need to have if we're going to have safe, affordable, and accessible water.
And Jill, just if I can add, it was not just from the perspective of can we get together and come up with a list. It really was centered in the values of community being first and being the experts on what was most important and impactful to them. And then what we did is relied upon the other experts in the room in terms of what they could bring with value added around why those particular pieces had to be in this list. This list is not exhaustive, but at the same time, it was critical that everyone understood that community voice was centered in this work.
Excellent point, Monica. That was really the entire point of bringing these folks together, is to make sure that we weren't putting our thoughts of what the needs were in, that we were listening and hearing the voices of community and those working directly with people in the communities. So that's what we did. Next slide, please.
I think another thing as you're advancing to the next slide is that there were at least 3 components to how we got to this list, that we actually walked through 3 different facilitated processes. One of those were just in terms of listening and gathering what was critical and important to the community, where people felt like trust had been breached, even with larger environmental groups. It was a very healthy space for people to be able to express that they felt as though that many times larger environmental groups had come and collaborated with frontline groups only to extract our stories or their information in order to pursue their own financial gains through funding and grants. And so we really wanted to make sure that there was a clear, transparent conversation around funding and how things are funded. We also talked about capacity issues and administrative support needs. So those things were also a part of the collective conversation. And it was also rooted in making sure that people understood that we felt like if this could be created as a model and a framework and a platform to build on, that the other many water issues that we have across the state and the region and the nation could actually be built and advanced on this value system.
Excellent points, Monica. And I think you'll notice that there's sort of a preamble to the 10 points that's up on this slide. And then there's also some copyright language at the bottom. And the reason we did that is not because we thought necessarily someone would steal this and do something with it, but we really wanted to ensure that this thing remains the property of the community folks who put it together. That they really saw this as 10 points that need to be together. And so we shouldn't just take one that might be easy and then say we're done, that we have to pay attention to all 10, and that this gives us that starting point for broader collaboration, because it was a consensus document among both community and some larger groups. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to go through each of these. I've tried to highlight the key phrases in each of them. But I'm going to do that in the next couple of slides, because one of the things we wanted to do for you is try to weave together these 10 points and how they fit with the presentations we've been hearing, and also the legislation that we've been hearing about or that may exist outside of these webinars. So next slide, please, Alexis. So as we jump in, this is the same list, but we've just used the short phrases that were highlighted so that we can compare with some of the bills we've been talking about, as well as with the presentations, and then some other things that we wanted to add in that are good things happening elsewhere. And I may not have hit every check mark on these legislative pieces. I did this, and so if you recognize that one of these actually is different than I've outlined, please let us know and we'll make that change before it gets posted. But if we start with water as a public trust, and it shouldn't be privatized. The Emergency Water as a Human Right Act, I think at least touches on that. The Ohio legislation, Water for All, that we heard about, that does seem to touch on privatization as well. I'm not sure either one of them enshrines it the way we're looking for, but these are steps in the right direction. And I really thought that this harkens back to this presentation about water as our life source. We can't give away this ultimate resource that keeps us all alive for someone else to control. So that's really number one, is this is a public trust and it needs to be there for everyone.
Jill, can I add that
Please do.
Legislation was influenced, like the Emergency Water is a Human Rights Act. The reason the water is a public trust component is checked there, it also was heavily influenced by the work from Flow, and also the work that was happening in Flint around the fact that Nestle was able to extract water at such a high volume for such a small amount of money. And then we were seeing the people of Flint not able to get that same deal. And so some of what was offered up at the table, the Water Unity table, was that there needed to be the advancement of at least some public trust language in many of these bills and legislation that we're lifting up. And so thank God that Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib actually had listening sessions to hear this directly from most impacted community. And we really applaud State Rep Crawley in Ohio and the work of Crystal Davis and Alicia Smith and also Christy Meyer, because they were able to give them some of these examples to make sure that Ohio was on the right path.
Absolutely. And the next one, I think this is the crux of it all, really, ensuring access to clean, safe, and affordable water for all. That's what we've been talking about. And interestingly, I think all of these bills do something to get us toward that. I don't think any of them are the be all end all. The emergency water bill is a really great piece, but it's short term for COVID. The Water Act is amazing, but it creates a fund, but it doesn't start by saying everybody has to have water. It asks for an affordability report. So all of these things are moving us in the right direction, but not necessarily all the way there yet. And then I also wanted to point out that we heard about this probably in all of the presentations, actually, But certainly the renters protection rang true for me, the structural racism, those pieces are such an important part to that ensuring this for everybody. And then we also saw in multiple states, including Michigan and Ohio, orders to turn water back on during COVID for those who may have been turned off previously by our governors. And so just wanted to point that out. Anything to add there, Monica?
I do. I think that also just to note that much of what is cited or noted in many of these policies, once again, came from community voice, actually pushing and elevating that there must be a human right to water, especially during a pandemic. And so I know that the Emergency Water is a Human Rights Act, actually, as the Congresswoman stated, was a bipartisan vote on the House side. And we're still waiting to see what's going to happen on the other side. But I know that Ohio definitely provided a lot of leadership in terms of moving very swiftly in with their water restoration position. And then also, as we look at Food and Water Watch, they have played a critical role in connecting many of the communities across the nation, like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Detroit, in terms of their voice being noted in the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act. But as Jill noted, none of them are giving us everything that we need, but they're giving us some really good bite sizes to be able to chew on and advance to get closer to the human right to water for all.
Excellent. Thank you, Monica. So next we talk about the sliding scale. This is really important because although there are pieces of this that are called other things out there, sometimes we heard in our presentations, they leave people out or they don't give them enough relief. And so we really want to see a sliding scale for water bills that helps those families not exceed probably 3.5% of income for their water bill. And so the first two I did not find where they included a sliding scale piece, neither the Water Act or the Emergency Water is a Human Right Act. It is in the Ohio legislation. I think that's great. And this is a very important component to the structural racism piece and ending that. One of the things we see is where you have large water systems that are serving many suburbs, many towns that have put a lot of resources into those water systems over 100 or more years. If the local community is now paying more than those suburbs for their water, that's a terrible disservice. So there is a huge structural racism component in how we manage those things. And so that is such an important piece in terms of making sure this is appropriate for the individual families. We hear a lot that it is difficult, and it is, but it's done. We have heating programs that do this and other programs that do this. And so we want to make sure that we're getting this much needed level of detail into the plans as they go forward.
And I think that it was so critical that the modeling of the sliding scale and income-based rate system was lifted, because as we heard, even through the deliberations at the Michigan Water Unity table, you had larger environmental justice groups at the table, or large environmental groups at the table, advocating for policy recommendations such as consolidation of systems, unknowing of the inequity that many times is baked into even that decision. And so we had to sort of take a moment to educate them that yes, it sounds like a good fix to just consolidate either these financially strapped systems or to consolidate a smaller system with a larger system, but that there really needed to be a level of caution around moving in that way unless you're including what is going to be in the best interest of, one, the historical population that the utility is connected to, and then how do you create a pathway to ensure that every person has access to it regardless of income. And so many of them had not always thought of all of those pieces. And so it became a really critical point to lift up that we were not all desirous of a consolidation of our systems, and that we also were seeking a model that would be more inclusive of ensuring that more people not only got turned on, but that all of those persons would be able to sustain access to water. And so I know that Jill may not be ready to announce it yet, but there will be some forthcoming recommendations that this particular model has been utilized for, to ensure that it is baked into the legislation for a greater advancement of water affordability.
Absolutely, Monica. And I should have also said and put in the presentations, I mean, we heard about this in Baltimore. It also is in place in Philadelphia. And so we know it can work. So we want to take that thread from something that's working and pull it into this and make sure that we do move that as a most important component. The fourth one is preserving and maintaining public health. And everybody got an X here because I think that's really what is moving things right now. And so I wanted to just say that right now we have a tension on water because of COVID. That gives us an opportunity to talk to legislators, water utilities, local city councils about the importance from a health perspective of everybody having access to water. This is a huge health inequity when you don't have access to running water in your home. And while we can stay alive by drinking bottled water, it's really hard to do hygiene with bottled water. So I think this is a huge component that people are aware of now because of the COVID pandemic, and that may be a small boost for us as we talk to legislators and others about why we need to be doing this.
Well, and I think also it definitely kudos to many of the partners at the table, like Wani Olivares and La Placita and Mike with Flint Development Center. You know, those folks really, in the very beginning, never stopped lifting up what was happening in Flint. And it was because that they never stopped talking and actually working through using science and research and voice and organizing tools to inform others as to what was happening, that they have in many instances also have been, subject matter experts that have been brought to the table to bring greater voice around the public health harms of what's happened to lead pipe issues with toxicity. And then also we know in places like Detroit, there have been groups like People's Water Board and Detroit Hydrate Detroit, and just so many other groups that have been able to lift and show the example of public harms when people don't have access to water. And so I think too that it's just always critical for us to note that many of these policies were influenced by community work that continue to lift up that we are being harmed and we are dying even prior to COVID from what's happening around the injustices and inequities of a lack of access to clean, safe, and affordable water. So kudos to all of the partners that have continued to do this work and continue to hold everyone accountable that we must do better. And definitely after a pandemic, we have no other choice but to move forward with greater water justice and making sure everybody has access.
Absolutely. So to move us to number 5, I didn't find really any legislation out there that I'm aware of right now that provides the opportunities for conservation and providing assistance to low-income residents to make sure they're aware of how they can be good stewards of their water, and they're able to look at their water bill in a way that shows how they can maybe save money, but certainly be a good steward of how that water is being utilized. And so the community really wanted to make sure this is a component. I also think this is one of those components that local municipalities can really take a hold of. It benefits the utility, the municipality, and the homeowner to help understand what you can do with low flow appliances and utilities, how you can, in some cases, save money through using less. I think those are all very important things, and we heard that clearly from community. But I don't see it yet in any of the pieces that we've seen coming from lawmakers.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen it in the policies yet, Jill, but I do think we've seen it evidenced at the community level when you look at the work that Reverend Pinckney and the Benton Harbor Water Council was able to do, not only to receive filters, but then to put filters on. When you look
Yes.
at the work that has been demonstrated around the preventative work, and then the conversations with young folks, like in Toledo, with Toledo Junction around green sustainable development and things of that nature. So we also want to just remind everybody, not every component of this plan is going to be manifested just within legislation. Some of it is more about our practice and our way of being, so that we're ushering in a group of younger water warriors that really value water, so we're not having to repeat these same fights for water access and water quality.
Absolutely. Such a great
Place
point.
to give a shameless plug to what's going to be soon to be announced is the Great Lakes People of Color Water Camp. Yay!
Yes. Yes, we have to get the young people involved. Absolutely. Alexis, next slide, please. One more thing I just want to, as we change slides, just want to mention is that not always can we completely focus on conservation. While we're working with lead pipes still in communities, we do have to be aware that sometimes if you have a lead service line or lead fixtures or pipes in your home, it is strongly recommended to flush those at least every morning, if not a few times a day. And so we also want to make sure we're taking those things into account so that we don't encourage people not to do that. So that's something we'll be thinking about as well. So to move on to our last five, this slide begins with quality customer service and human dignity of all the people that a utility serves. I think we hear this loud and clear multiple times, because from sitting in meetings with water utilities and other utilities, I know that in the process of training our water managers, our utility managers, we've somehow gotten this idea across that customers are just ratepayers. And in fact, that's how they often refer to us, as ratepayers. And so this one is, I think, important for us to recognize that it's part of this job is for us to be working with our local water utilities and other utilities to help them understand that we're all in this together. We don't want to take their money away. We want to figure out how we make it work. But it's all also about ensuring human dignity, that we're maintaining that connection to water, and that we're not all seen as ratepayers, but rather as customers who are participating in this water system. I didn't see that in any of the policies yet, but I do think this is another area where our local municipalities and groups can really work to bridge that gap. And this is another area where Reverend Pinckney has done a great job of that. He reached out with the Water Council to the local water utility and actually was able to provide the testing that was necessary for compliance. And that's a great example of how community can participate and ensure that we're getting those things done.
And I know too, Jill, that the quality customer service component of the 10-point must-have water affordability plan has been a critical part of the conversations that we've been able to have over a period of about 5 to 6 months that was facilitated by the U.S. Water Alliance, along with many of our partners like Peter Hammer and Nick Leonard and Aaron Metty, and also my colleague and mentor, Cecily McClellan of We the People of Detroit. And so using number 6, the quality customer service engagement model, actually helped us at least advance lifting up about 23 recommendations to the water department to improve not only water access, but then sustained water access. So even though we're still not able to see the full manifestation of it in policy, codified in policy, it still is helping advance the conversation, because before that, it was difficult to even meet with the utility because there had been such a bad relationship between the customers and the utility.
Excellent point. Yes, thank you. The next point is appropriate ways to deal with past consumer debt. This is critical. What we know is that consumer debt in some places is added to people's taxes, and then eventually a lien can be placed against the home, and the home can be lost over a water bill. That is overwhelming. And so not only losing your water, but then eventually losing your home. I'm so glad to see that the Emergency Water is a Human Right Act includes this, as does the Ohio legislation, as well as under other, you'll see Chicago Utility Bill Relief Program. And that is a program that Chicago has created. I think it's getting started in terms of sign up now. But essentially, if people qualify for the Heating Assistance Program, LIHEAP, they can also qualify for this program for water. And it will reduce their bill for 12 months by 50%. And if they're able to stay current for 12 months, all of their past debt will be forgiven at the end of that 12-month period. This isn't a panacea, obviously, but we need those forward-looking efforts to find federal dollars, state dollars, local dollars to make sure that people can get rid of those past debts and that they can continue to have their water after that 12-month period. So this is a really big one that has to be dealt with in multiple ways, but it's good to see at least one city working toward that.
And Jill, I'd like to offer too that number 7 in terms of past consumer debt was a piece that was able to be lifted up to Governor Whitmer as she was looking at shaping her executive orders relative to water restoration and at least sustaining it through COVID-19. And so much of what we've continued to lift up to the governor's attention is around the fact that it is not only the fact that people cannot afford to get their water restored because of past debt, but then we're also deeply concerned about the accruing debt, because even though she is now providing a $25 restoration pathway, that $25 only connects you to your water source. It does not remove the cost of your water in terms of what you are using during the pandemic. Neither does it remove or cancel your prior debt. And so it's still critical for us to continue to remind folks that after the pandemic, even with those communities that have provided some pathway of restoration, that we must address the legacy debt and the harm that is going to have ripple effects, not only around water, but also home ownership and family stability. So we are definitely pushing very strongly for a pathway to addressing and forgiving much of the debt that has been accrued. I mean, we've done it for big business. We should be able to do it for working and families and American residents.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for raising that. It's critical that we get a handle on this debt situation. The 8th thing is eschew water shutoffs. No shutoffs. That is, we talked about that for the last weeks. I did not see that in the Water Act. I think they're waiting for the report. I think that's the hope, is that it would come out in the report and that it would be there. But I did see it in the Emergency Water is a Human Right Act, of course. It's in the Ohio legislation. And again, we've seen that from some of our governors saying everybody had to be reconnected.
And part of why there's such a need for the reporting is that what we found over 20 years of the city of Detroit struggling around this issue of water shutoffs is that many times the utilities are masking the harm by either destroying data or not providing it, or playing games in the FOIA process of only giving you pieces of the data. And so you go through a very elongated process of trying to stitch together information that really in the 70s was readily provided and mailed to, to residents and taxpayers. And so we have to question, why is there not more transparency from utilities around how many people are being shut off and how many people are being restored or even repeat shutoffs and restorations. But we also take the position that we don't want to wait for reports and more research to know just from basic public health that when people don't have access to clean, safe, and affordable water, when they don't have access to sanitation, that there is a public health impact from that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So our number 9 is water assistance plans must be rejected. What we know is water assistance plans are short-term, and they usually do not tier with people's income. So they may provide short-term help, and that can be useful if somebody loses a job. We still want to have that short-term help available, but it cannot be the whole solution. We need affordable water in addition to some short-term help that would go for specific needs. Of course, this isn't in anything yet, but we, it is an important component because we want to make sure that as we bring these to legislators, that they understand the difference between an assistance plan and an affordability plan. And maybe I'll just jump to 10 and then you can jump in, Monica. Sort of the same thing for tiered water pricing plans. What that means is that's kind of block pricing, if you're familiar with that. So you pay a small amount for a basic amount of water in a first block of water. And that then, as you use more water, you pay for more water with increasing prices for increasing blocks of water. The problem with that is sometimes we have households of many people because people are now doing multi-generational living, and some of that is because of low income. And so what we don't want to do is not provide enough water. The other piece of that is it doesn't necessarily get you to the lowest income households. If your first block is still too expensive for you, then you still don't have affordable water. Thoughts on those two, Monica?
You were right on, Jill. I have nothing that I could add.
Okay, all right. So I would actually like to kind of take a breath here and offer a time for some thoughts, questions. And the way I think we can do that, we have about 30 people on, so I don't want everybody, want us talking over each other. But if you want to ask a question, clarifying any of this stuff so far or thoughts about it so far, if you'd raise your hand, then Alexis will let us know who's going to ask a question and we can go from there. And maybe we don't have any questions yet. I find that hard to believe amongst this group of advocates, but I'll believe you.
This may be a resounding amen, Jill.
That could be. Good point, Monica. All right. So then I think what I'll do, seeing no questions, is we'll go to the next slide, please, Alexis.
Wait a minute, Jill. I think we have one.
Oh, okay, great.
Can we allow Mr. Pauly, Ben Pauly?
Excellent. Good call, Monica.
Because I think he's having some trouble finding the icon, but he did put something in the chat.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I was just asking about how to raise hands, because I know that on the last couple calls, there was a little icon there and I wasn't seeing it. So that was my only question.
Oh,
That's okay. That's an important one. Alexis, can you help us tell people how to do that? Or
Yeah.
maybe.
Sorry about that. So normally there is an icon at the bottom in your toolbar. Ben, are you seeing that at the bottom where you would see chat box and everything?
No, I'm not seeing the usual raise hand icon.
Okay. Thank you. So what we'll do, what I suggest then instead, Jill, is if people do want to raise their hand, maybe they can type it in the chat box. Apologize for that though.
No worries. I think that's a great idea. So if you'd like to ask a question, just put something in the chat box and we'll recognize you.
So while I'm unmuted, actually,
Yes.
I do have a question for Monica. Some of us in Flint are working right now to try to establish more of a relationship with our local water utility. And that's proving to be challenging for a number of reasons. For one thing, we're finding that the utility is maybe not totally receptive. It doesn't have a very strong presence within the community. Doesn't even have a website that you can go to find out, what it's up to and to get information. And so the interface between the utility and the community is really limited. And, of course, in addition to that, even when you try to dig for information about water shutoffs and that sort of thing, you often find that it either doesn't exist or it's not good quality, or there are all kinds of obstacles to accessing it. And so I was really interested to hear Monica talking about some of the dialogue that is now going on between activists in Detroit and the local water department. And so I'm just interested in, and maybe this is a longer conversation for another time, but building stronger relationships between people working at the grassroots level and our local water utilities seems to be a really important part of all of this. And I'd be interested in whatever advice and recommendations she might have for us.
Great question, Ben. Excellent. Monica, you want to tackle at least part of that?
Definitely. And Ben, we can definitely have a longer conversation offline, but just to give you sort of maybe some of the high points of what we had to do and what we learned is that we had difficulty really engaging in any kind of conversation with our utility without a lot of hostility because it was very antagonistic and had been so for a long period of time. And part of it was around this very negative narrative that Detroit was gouging the rest of the region. And because our utility had been really under attack since the 70s under a federal judge, we were really dealing with sort of this suburb versus urban, very racialized conversation. And so it was by going to multiple tables, desperately seeking a pathway to how we could get water on for Detroit, and also community-driven research. So we had information and intel that other people didn't have, so we could speak very directly to it, but with, rooted in science and data. But then it was through being able to have a partner like Freshwater Future, and then the influence of Jill and her leadership being able to help convene us with some funders. And it was really the influence of those funders that brought them to the table. So, Jill, and this is why I said it, a good 5 times, that relationships are everything, because they are. if we had not spent the time invested at the table with Freshwater Futures to really learn where else were there levers and influencers around this water issue that we saw as bigger than us and nothing that we could really tackle and have been trying to battle for 2 decades. People before we, the people of Detroit, there's been a legacy of leadership around it. And so through that, Jill just willing to say, I'm willing to reach out to some folks and convene a meeting. Those folks were willing to come to the table. So I would really suggest, if there is anyone that has influence with your funders and foundations, I know for sure that the Mott Foundation is very interested in water affordability. And so I think that that would be a strong place to start, is seeing if you can get maybe Tim Eden to convene maybe a sit down with you and some other community members and the utility to have this conversation. But just also as a word of caution too, it's going to be very important to do your homework and make sure that you're bringing representation that has a broad voice of the community, because if only a small group of people go to sort of have these dialogues, then sometimes that can be perceived by other community members as you negotiating something without their knowledge. And that too can make it very difficult to advance some kind of best interest policy or issue. And the last thing I'll say is too, what we recognize from doing our homework is that our utility is in a very difficult financial situation because of the mandated lead line replacement. So the very community that they have not been engaged with, they now are seeking our support and our vote to get more funding for lead pipe replacement. So it made it perfect timing for them to listen where they had not been willing to listen before. But we can definitely talk more, Ben. And
yes, I'd love to. That's such great advice, Monica, and I'd love to follow up with both you and Jill offline sometime. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for the question and great answer, Monica. I see also Horst has a question, so we'll take that question as well if we can unmute him. There you go. I think you're live now.
I'm unmuted. Okay. What can I say? Free to talk at last, right?
Right.
Good one. Hi, Monica. Good to hear from you today as well. I thought using a Saul Alinsky tactic, which would be to march in the neighborhood of the privileged. And one of those areas, I was down in Detroit for the first time ever in January. And I was looking at the downtown and then the near downtown areas that are gentrified and all the money that's been put into that. And to say, you know, how can you justify this and not allow other people to, you know, have the basics? You know, just the disparity between you having these gentrified areas and then having the areas where people are struggling just to try to get the basics. So you know, putting the money into it, but also saying, you know, how about the jobs that come with all of this? So that's just some thoughts that I have. I don't know if it's worth exploring at this point.
No, it's critical, Mr. Horace, because it's a part of what has created the disparity. When a community actually has extracted from it its ability to create its own jobs, contracts, and training, its ability to connect opportunity to those persons that reside and live in that community. And as Jill stated, many of your large urban, large utilities, water utilities, and those large cities like Detroit and Benton Harbor, Flint and Detroit, and you're looking at Philly and all up and down that Rust Belt, many of those had multiple issues. And that's what Jill had spoken to early, is that there has been historic harms and racial disparity baked into policies. And so when you look at, you know, just the housing policies that came out of the GI Bill was deeply steeped in racial divide. You know, so a city like Detroit, you had white homeowners, once they decided to flee the city, who was left? The sick and the elderly and the poor. So those persons were having difficulty getting a home loan. But then when you look at even in current history, for example, in the city of Detroit, since 2009, over 100,000 homeowners have been illegally and unconstitutionally overtaxed. And then what was the response? And we have actually a supposed Democrat leading the city. He said, my bad, too bad. When you look at what's happening in Chicago, water shutoffs are still happening in Chicago, as some of us were applauding the mayor of Chicago for saying she wasn't going to shut water off. Well, she didn't shut water off. She just didn't turn it on. When you look at Toledo, you know, so we have to really, and this is one of the things I love about talking with you, because you always bring another perspective. And that perspective is still rooted in justice, is that we have to really keep the main thing, the main thing. And the main thing is that we are looking at the interconnected, as Reverend Pinckney says, of everything. It's not one thing, it's everything, and it's all connected. So when you take the jobs out of Detroit and you fleece them out to the suburbs, and the people move out to the suburbs, well, the tax base that was meant to sustain the infrastructure and the bonds that were actually lent to build the infrastructure have now fled to the suburbs. So we can't recoup what is really necessary to sustain what has been beneficial to what, 40% of the state of Michigan? But because we've been living with 50 years of a very racist narrative that said the last one out cut the lights off on Detroit, people didn't recognize how deeply connected Detroit's survival and vitality is to the health and the welfare of the entire commons for at least almost half the state of Michigan. And so this too has to be why we connect the dots for people. And this is why it's been so important to work with you and to work with Tony Spinola and so many other people across the state, because you get it. You get that it's not just about protecting just the water infrastructure for one particular municipality, but it's about protecting the water commons for all humanity. So I really appreciate you and the UPEC for all the work you've done to make sure that there is not this alienation of Detroit versus everyone else, or people not connecting what's happening with Chicago and Toledo and Benton Harbor and all around the Great Lakes to really the necessary move that we all must make to work together. We cannot allow on our watch the Great Lakes to be robbed and privatized and destroyed. And so I just thank you, Mr. Horace, because you've been a great champion for the Great Lakes.
Thank you for the question, Horace. We appreciate it. And one thing I want to reiterate from Monica's great statement is what we have learned in this process over the past 5 or 8 years of looking at drinking water intensively is some of the things we used to think were about protecting the environment are really about protecting us. When you're looking at mining waste that could flow into rivers, that becomes a drinking water issue that impacts us as humans, and it increases the cost of water. So it becomes an affordability issue. The same with PFAS. Those toxins are now being found across Michigan. They're problematic. We're having to create new infrastructure for people who used to be able to rely on well water. And we're also having to have people rely on filters and other tools. So, you know, I think the great thing about this whole group of people is that we see this problem from multiple perspectives. But when it comes down to it, we're all working toward the same thing. It's the Great Lakes, it's our inland lakes and rivers, it's our municipal water systems, and they're all interconnected. And then on top of that, it's also connected to jobs and good paying jobs and ability to find housing and many more things. And so great question. And I just think there is a lot of work to do. Did you have something, Monica?
No, ma'am. Go right ahead, Jill.
Okay. All right. Well, I will move us on at this point. I I know we want to be able to have more discussion. And so we
Jill?
were, yes.
Sorry, real quick. Oh, do we have time for one more question? It looks like Councilwoman Adams had her hand up. Which
Okay, sure. Councilwoman?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was moving.
I just want to know, I like everything that I've just heard, and it was the very thing that made me legislatively look at bringing in medical marijuana and having an epileptic child. And she lived in Flint with my other family members, and she passed a couple of years ago. But I knew that it was important to create jobs in some form or fashion to be able or to enable us to be raising any type of rates on the residents. And for some reason, this is what I hate about politics. I sat on the St. Joe Benton Harbor River Authority board, and I watched Fred Upton for years come up with all these millions of dollars to dredge the river for recreational boating, but nothing for the infrastructure of the citizens of Benton Harbor. And now we're dealing with a city engineer that didn't even want to see the income tax pass because they too were going to have to pay, along with all of Whirlpool employees that are now being laid off due to COVID, they say, and they're no longer going to pay into those taxes. And just recently, my colleagues agreed to go into a $12 million bond. I mean, they watch our bonds, and they're the ones that keep coming forth to incur costs on the poor and impoverished of this community. And for the likes of me, I just don't understand. I feel like sometimes I'm fighting this alone, and it's frustrating. And I need Reverend Pinckney to come forth to the council and demand that some type of mapping goes on of keeping up with where those lead pipes have been replaced, and anything that's going on concerning our water.
Well, Councilwoman, I so appreciate your question and your statement. I think one of the things that we know is we do need to have those partnerships between elected officials, local elected officials who understand these issues like you do, and the local community groups who can help to press for some of those things. So I know that will make sense, and that Water Council will be there to help you with that. I also want to say there are multiple tools as well. And this is one of the things Monica wanted to make sure we talked about today, is that there's a gap. We recognize that there's a gap in terms of when you're an elected official, you have a huge job, a huge responsibility. And so you don't always get trained or sufficient knowledge about what are the tools you can use for these sorts of things. One of them that we heard about earlier in our presentations is community benefits agreements. So if somebody wants to come in and be doing their business in Benton Harbor, you can consider, can we get a community benefit agreement between the city, the residents, and this entity, whoever that is that wants to do those activities? So I totally get that, and I think probably Monica has more to add there.
No, thank you so much, Councilwoman. First of all, just for your leadership. There is so much that you've been a part of in advancing the work that's happening with the Benton Harbor Water Council. But I also would just add to what Jill has stated, where we also can push some levers. Sometimes it's not on the water policy directly, but it may be more with like the HUD dollars that come in that you guys are going to have to approve. Some of what you can allocate there or you can demand is that those dollars not move forward without it being connected to jobs, contracts, and training for local community. So there is, as Jill stated, there are some techniques, some tactics that we can share and teach. And then there also are some retired legislators at the different levels of government that we can bring together to mentor and coach you through some of these tactics so that you're going to the table locked and loaded, as they say, business.
Yeah, so I hope that helps a little, Councilwoman, but we do appreciate all you're doing. And I think that's part of what we want to do after today, is that we're going to work with, you've heard me mention and thank All About Water. So that's a wonderful group of people like Monica and Reverend Pinckney and Wani and many others that help really direct how do we get to this work. And so we want to open that up to other groups, and we also want to create new groups, like maybe local elected officials. Can we have a group for local elected officials? Maybe you have a call once a month. It might be just to talk amongst yourselves. It might be to do a training piece on some particular topic. But that's part of what we want to know as everybody finishes with this series today. We hope you'll tell us after you've had time to think about this, what would be helpful? What are next steps that we can continue to help with? We'll have some because we want to move things like the Emergency Act. So that's something we can all help with. But we also want to help with all of this work at the 3 levels so that we can get all of these points and the jobs and the things we've been talking about. So thank you so much. All right. I'm so glad we got to that question. Would you go to the next slide, please, Alexis? All right. That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure we were at the end of our slide piece. We have 20 minutes left, and we only have 24 people. So what I'm going to suggest is that rather than try to do breakouts, we're just going to talk as a group. We're going to have more conversation. But I think I think some of what we're interested in is understanding what we learned, that some folks want to work at particular levels or at all levels, that people are at different places working at different pieces. And so it would be great to have a conversation now, and we'll use the chat box again so that we can queue ourselves up one at a time. But it would be great to just have a conversation about how do we begin to help people. What are you thinking in terms of needs? Where are you wanting to engage that we can help connect you with resources or other things? So I think if we could move toward that conversation. Monica, does that sound like an okay? We're kind of tag teaming here in real time, so.
Sounds perfect, Jill.
All right. And did you want to, are there any particular questions you want to start with, Monica? Or thoughts?
Well, it seemed like there was a lot of attention around how to get more support for their local issues and how to lead in terms of convening. So maybe if we start with local. Excellent.
Okay. So if you have local thoughts or questions about how we work forward on this, if you would put something in the chat box, we will unmute. I know we've had some people say they had to run, so we've seen a few less people, but that's okay for a conversation sometimes. All right, I'm seeing someone, Mary Alice, is that you asking about the water lab? Excellent. So can we unmute the councilwoman again, please?
Okay, I guess my initial question would be, I had a conversation with a young lady that owns nearly 100-year-old factory that she was being squeezed out of her property by this big old Harbor Shores thing. Anyway, she's still there, and she owns a very nice piece of property. And mind you, I think I shared that the water that comes from the water plant is clean, but by the time it travels through the old infrastructure, it's full. and contaminated.
Yeah.
She sits close to the plant, and I was wondering, is there any type of resources, funding that may be available to help us to start our own lab or start a water bottling facility, something, you know. I went off on the city engineer the other night at a meeting because I just got tired, and before I knew it, I snapped. And that relationships are everything.
Right.
And I've been trying to gain one with them, but I guess I'm tired of them watching the poor impoverished dollars and how to spend them and run us up out of Benton Harbor instead of engineering a way to help us to pay for that plant that they helped us to get in debt for. And I'm just been trying to figure out how, and she thought that it was a wonderful idea. So to enter into a partnership, because when something goes wrong, it would be nice to have some water stored somewhere. Bottled up,
Yes.
or to help other communities that may need it.
Absolutely. And I see Monica chiming in, and so I'll give you a short piece. I think absolutely. And I think one of the things to start that work is for you as a councilwoman and the Water Council to call the community together and have a listening session about what do we need, what could help. That's how we started in Flint, and that's what created the Water Lab.
Okay.
And so I think that's such an important piece.
Yes.
And then we're always happy to sit down and look at where are their resources and try to figure that out. So we would be happy at any point to have those conversations with you.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
You're muted, Monica.
Sorry about that. We've also found, Councilwoman, that is very productive to be able to bring in some of your partners across the state and across the nation, to be able to lift up to your community best practices. So this would be a great opportunity, because we know that you and Reverend Pinckney could pick up the phone, and I'm sure that Michael Harris would respond, or I'm sure that Alicia Smith would come, and along with some other partners that Jill and we have access to be able to say, this is what we've done, and this is what it looks like. This is how it would roll out for you. And so that too, I would offer that. So rely on your bench, and you have resources throughout Freshwater Future that for some of those particular issues you're speaking to around some alternative funding and things of that nature. We definitely have people that can help with that and speak to it. And then I also know that through conversations with the All About Water subcommittee, is that we're still looking at too, having some deeper conversations on a broader scale and some teach-ins and trainings around finance and funding as it relates to water and water infrastructure and creating more affordability.
I think you made her cry, Monica.
No.
But good tears.
Love you, Councilwoman.
Well, we're right there with you, Councilwoman, and we love you and what you and the Reverend and everyone is doing there, and we're here for you. Absolutely. Love the ideas too. I love the ideas, because that's what it's all about. It's hearing the community needs and figuring out how you make that happen. And I know, if I know Mary Alice Adams, she knows how to make it happen. We have a comment that says we need more elected officials like you, Councilwoman Adams. I would definitely second that.
Jill,
Yes.
this is Alicia, if I may.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring to the attention the ability for not only our legislators to learn from the community through the listening and focus groups, but also to use social media and other means of communications to begin to communicate with the residents about what's going on. Many times you don't have movement in community because families do not know what's happening. Whereas you have the high water rates, that's going to be impactful to those families in Benton Harbor. And you're paying for water that you really should not be consuming because of the high lead levels. You need to have some type of advertisement marketing about that, and not to just shame the commissioners who have made this agreement without residential support, which is a lack of democracy, but also to actually permit the residents to have a voice. So Commissioner, we'd be happy to help with that process as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I also want to say to everyone on this call, this is kind of why we had this series, is we want to be able to help you. And so, you know, if there are other communities, other groups thinking I need to have a conversation with Alicia or Brandon or Jill or Monica or whoever it is, that's what we hope for. We really want to be able to have those conversations, help you over the hurdles you're struggling with, and potentially help you also to see maybe some resources that you might not have known about. So happy to have those conversations, and thank you, Alicia. I also want to say that our local elected officials have huge jobs, and we are so thankful for those officials, and especially where their heart is into their community, as Commissioner Adams obviously is. And so we definitely want to figure out how do we bridge between groups like water councils or watershed groups and those elected officials, because sometimes people who may seem like they're not engaged or don't get it, sometimes they just need that nudge and information and learning. And so I loved what Monica said about that, and I know with Councilwoman Adams, she puts herself places, and she is sure to be there. But we can also help think about how do we help move some of those elected officials to a place where they're more open and can hear more of those messages.
And also, Councilwoman, just to lift it again, is that we really are not only working toward the work that we can do right now that's in front of us, but then building toward the future. So again, the Great Lakes People of Color Water Policy Camp is going to be a critical part of preparing this next generation of leaders to not only be able to manage the water infrastructure, not only do the research and test the water, but they'll also be able to build the policies that are more equitable and just and more inclusive for everyone. So we're excited about all of those pieces, and we're hoping too that that will be work that we can also count on you being a part of, because we believe that as they're learning, we also want them to be able to point to great models of leadership from the legislative side of the work.
Absolutely. So I don't see other questions. If you have other thoughts or questions that you would like to share, please do put something in the chat box. But while we're waiting for that, I want to talk about a few specifics. We do have the Water Acts that are moving. At least the Emergency Water Act appears to be moving, we heard. And so we will be reaching out to everyone to try and provide tools so you can engage your networks in moving some of those things forward. So we'll, on the national piece, we'll be in touch on that. But also in Ohio, there is a piece of legislation, the Water for All Act, that we want to make sure continues to move as well. And so we will be in touch with folks from Ohio on that. We also have several things happening in Michigan. We would love to see legislation moving on permanent water affordability and moratoria. So we will be in touch with Michigan folks definitely about that. And we would love to hear from others what things you have moving so that we can help to get the word out about those things. So this isn't the end, even though it's the end of the 6-part series, it's not the end of our engagement. We want to ensure that this is the beginning of conversations or the middle. And so we will be sending out tools essentially to get us connected over the coming weeks. So there are potentially conference calls like this, video calls. We can create things that would work for people. So we will also be looking for some feedback from you. So there will be one last survey where we just ask you what things would help so that we can make sure we're trying to provide the things that you would find helpful to the extent we can. Let's see. I don't see any further questions at this point. We have some very nice sentiments in the comments. Monica, would you like to have a last word? Oh, you're muted.
I think that's been part of the show today, is I said you've had to unmute me. But thank you, Jill, once again, just for the exceptional leadership and for all of the team at Freshwater Future. You guys, once again, knocked it out the park. All the speakers, all of the participants, everyone that's weighed in. If you put something in the chat, if you sent a compliment, if you sent a critique, we welcome all of that, because All About Water is all about you. And so we're very grateful for all the work that you're doing. We continue to pray that all of your work would be blessed. We know that you agree with us that water is a human right. We know that you stand with us in that fight. So we'll say to you, in the words of a great leader here from the city of Detroit, when you find a good fight, get in it. We don't only want you to get in it, we want you to stay in the fight for the human right to water. So I'm out, Jill.
All right, thank you so much, Monica. Always a pleasure. Thank you, Councilwoman. Thank you, every participant, all the staff people, the presenters. It's been a great couple of weeks, and we really, really appreciate all you do on the ground. So we look forward to staying in touch, and everybody have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.